Items have had a huge shift since the last patch, with items now being designed to be specialised at one specific thing. In this video we're going to go over exactly how this changes the top builds for every ADC in Smite 2, and considering the benefits and drawbacks of each build path, including their power curves and how much damage they do to different enemy types. Let's get into it. Let's start with a standard hunter, which is like imagining a hunter with no abilities and only their auto attacks. First off is the top late game sharpshooters arrow builds when no enemies have built spectral armor. These are the builds that kill the entire enemy team the fastest, and the build order is mathematically correct. After all of the item changes, it's pretty clear crit is coming out on top, with the top 5 highest possible damage builds containing Demon Blade, Rage and Deathbringer, which isn't surprising considering that Deathbringer now gives 35% extra crit damage, so gains insane efficiency when paired with a fully stacked Rage. And with Demon Blade now providing a massive up to 45% attack speed, even the recently heavily nerfed Kins is appearing in the top damage build. Before this patch, Kins was a must-buy item, but the second build shows us that Kins is no longer a buy every game item, with Crit, Pen and Odysseus' Bow providing enough damage to the whole enemy team that it makes Kins unnecessary. But we can see that having Kins in the build does increase damage to tanks substantially, but the trade-off is that your damage towards squishies won't be as high. So out of the top 5 builds I'm showing you, you can decide if you want Kins for higher damage to tanks, or Odysseus' Bow, Brace of the Abyss, Sunbeam Bow or Tearfing for higher damage to squishy targets. As when Kins isn't in the build, it slightly hurts your damage towards tanks, but not by much at all. Now let's go to the other end of the spectrum. Crit is highly favoured here because the enemies don't have spectral, and the starter item is Sharpshooter's Arrow, which leans the optimal builds towards higher crit chance. So let's look at the top Hunter's Cowl builds when enemies have spectral, and the starter item is Hunter's Cowl. There is almost no difference in the builds, with the top build for Sharpshooter's Arrow when enemies don't have spectral actually being identical to the top Hunter's Cowl build when enemies do have spectral. There are some small differences between these two sets of builds. Kins appears in all of the top Hunter's Cowl builds and replaces Titan's Bane when compared to the Sharpshooter's Arrow builds, which is just showing us that the slightly lower crit chance and slightly higher attack speed from Hunter's Cowl means that Kins is more efficient in the Hunter's Cowl builds than Titan's Bane. Another thing that is now discouraging Titan's Bane and Executioner appearing in builds together is that Executioner now decreases enemy protections instead of increasing your protections. So percent penetration items and Executioner now have a small inefficiency when paired together, but this inefficiency is really small and shouldn't be something you worry too much about. So crit is supreme in this meta, right? Well, the issue with displaying just the top late game builds for ADCs is that we haven't considered how it will feel earlier in the game to actually build these items. For example, Rage is showing to be an amazing crit item that highly encourages Deathbringer and Demon Blade to be in the builds. And the synergy between these items, with Rage giving high crit chance, Deathbringer increasing your crit damage by a massive 35% now, and Demon Blade giving you tons of attack speed, means that these 3 items are bound to always appear in the top builds. But when you buy just one of these crit items during the game, they are weak, as they are all relying on each other to maximize their damage. So the huge power spike you get from these items doesn't come online until you have completed all 3 of them. Having just one of these crit items will be fairly weak, having 2 will be okay, and then having all 3 makes for the highest damage 3 item combination in the game. This is by design, as the devs have decreased the crit chance on Deathbringer and Demon Blade, but buffed their passives by insane amounts. But to get the most out of these items, you need high crit chance. So Rage and the crit item changes makes crit builds almost always the best late game builds for ADCs. But Rage has to be stacked, and so the efficiency it brings to the table takes a long time to come online. So the consequences of building Demon Blade, Rage and Deathbringer is twofold. When buying the items, you'll have weak power spikes, and you won't get the full efficiency of your crit items until you have brought all 3, and you've fully stacked your Rage. To make the best decisions when it comes to building in this patch, we're going to have to consider build order, because we know now how weak and slow the crit builds are going to be to come online. So to maximize your chances of winning a match, we need to see how building these late game high crit builds compared to other builds at different points in the game. What's the point of building the best late game build if you lose before you even finish your items? Here's a graph of the highest damage first items an ADC can build at level 5, when we just consider you hitting the enemy ADC. The best first item an ADC can build by looking at this graph is the new item, Tearfing, which gives 50 strength, 10% attack speed, and gives you extra damage on your auto attacks that increases as you basic attack enemies. At level 5, it provides 15 extra damage to all of your basic attacks, another 15 once you have autoed an enemy once, and another 15 once you auto an enemy again. I've done some math behind the scenes to allow for this stacking effect, so these DPS numbers are completely accurate. So Tyrfing now has a higher DPS than even the extremely expensive Avatar's Parachute, and is a steal at 3,250 gold, making it very likely to be the meta first item in OB8. Like last patch, Sunbeam Bow is still a good first item, but I don't see much point in buying this first now that Tyrfing exists. We also have Bracer of the Abyss, which has been buffed this patch to provide 10 basic attack damage per stack, stacking up to a massive 8 times. I have modelled it at 40 basic attack damage and it appears 4th in this list, but it will be a solid item on gods with any intelligence scaling, and will do more damage than Tyrfing when fully stacked. But it's a little bit temperamental and encourages you to all-in enemies. You don't want to have little poke fights and retreat when you have Bracer of the Abyss. You want to hit the go button, stack the item up, and kill the enemy before you lose the stacks. It's a high risk, high reward item, but it will be very poor for farming if you have no intelligence scaling on your abilities. The same goes for if you're fighting an enemy ADC who has this item. You don't want to have prolonged fights with them, because the more they hit you, the more damage they will do. So you want to try and poke and only trade a few auto attacks at a time before retreating. Braggy's Harp is still a good choice, but does almost the exact same thing as Tyrfing, just slightly weaker, and so it's completely overshadowed by it. Now these are the top 10 highest damage first items, but it's not all about damage. If we consider the cost of these items, we are able to see their relative power curves, which lets us relate how much damage the item does with how long it takes for the build to come online, by considering its cost. The higher an item is on this graph, the better its power curve. Now we can see the items which have the best power curves. Tyrfing is an easy winner in OB8, being both the highest damage first item an ADC can buy, and also being the most cost efficient. Sunbeam Bow is still a close second. Bracer of the Abyss and Braggy's Harp are also tied, but Bracer will be better at being a super aggressive first item, while Braggy's Harp will be better for farming, because Braggy's passive procs on minions and jungle camps, while Bracer's does not. We can see Demon Blade fairly low on the list, with a poor power curve, but when I showed you the top builds earlier, Demon Blade was showing to be the most optimal first item when building those builds, which shows us how weak building for late game will be in the early game. If you build Demon Blade as a first item, an enemy ADC who has built Tyrfing or Bracer of the Abyss will severely outdamage you, meaning that it's likely they'll begin to push ahead of you in terms of farm and make it more likely that they will win the game. I want to mention here that I have changed how Demon Blade's passive is simulated in my model. Its passive attack speed now depends on your crit chance and how many times you hit an enemy before they die, making Demon Blade the most accurate it has ever been in my videos. Dagger of Frenzy has been hugely buffed this patch, providing 50% attack speed for 6 auto attacks when activated, making it a really strong contender for the best first item an ADC can build. It also provides extra basic attack damage when activated, which makes it scale well with crit chance in the later stages of the game. If we look at the graph when Dagger of Frenzy is active, it towers above the rest of the items, out DPSing Tyrfing substantially, and when we run the power curve analysis, its efficiency for its price is phenomenal. With the insane amounts of early damage available to hunters now with Tyrfing and Dagger of Frenzy, Lifesteal items are going to suffer greatly because they provide such low damage when built as a first item. You can see just how weak Bloodforge, Nimble Ring, Dvar's Gauntlet and the Reaper is compared to the highest damage first items, and it's pretty likely you'll underperform if you build Lifesteal when the enemy builds any of the top damage first items. And when we run the power curve analysis, we can see those items perform even weaker still. I've also put Dagger of Frenzy when it isn't active so you can see how its activated and inactivated states compare. This graph shows you if your Dagger of Frenzy isn't activated, you shouldn't attempt to fight the enemy unless you already have a good advantage. So overall, the best first items for ADCs this patch are Tyrfing, Dagger of Frenzy and Bracer of the Abyss. Tyrfing will be best on ADCs with no intelligence scaling and an attack speed stim, like Rama, Artemis, Anhur Aspect or Jing Wei, as you can activate your stim to get more efficiency out of Tyrfing because it scales with, or gets better with, higher attack speed, because you get more procs per second with higher attack speed. Bracer of the Abyss will be good on ADCs with intelligence scaling, like Cernunnos, Dancer, Zeus and Cupid, and even better on Izanami, Bari and Poseidon's Aspect, as they have attack speed stims that they can activate to stack up Bracer on enemy gods even faster. I think it might be particularly good on Bari, who will go into spirit form more often with Bracer of the Abyss's 30% attack speed, because she'll fire out more auto attacks per second and gain spirit form faster. But remember, Brace of the Abyss will affect your ability to clear, as you won't have the stacks when hitting minions and buff camps, and will be for confident players who want to play super aggressive in the early game. Dagger of Frenzy will be good for gods that want to all in, like Cernunnos or Artemis. You can activate the item and crowd control enemies in order to hit all 6 of the auto attacks. It's up to you to decide what suits your god, your playstyle, and match up the most, but all 3 of these items will be solid first pickups. So that's our best first items as an ADC. Now let's consider our best 2 item combination when ADCs are level 10. Again, we're just looking at DPS versus the enemy ADC. Tyrfing is a clear winner when considering the best 2 item power spikes, and appears in the top 5 best 2 item combinations. It will do the most damage when paired with Sunbeam Bow, but quite surprisingly, Tyrfing and Demon Blade is a solid 2 item combination, with the attack speed from Demon Blade pairing nicely with Tyrfing's passive, and the crit chance pairing well with Tyrfing's high strength. Then we have Tyrfing with Bracer of the Abyss, which again synergizes well together, especially because their passives behave in a similar way. Deathbringer and Demon Blade also appears in this top 10 list, showing they're a decent pairing of items even without rage in the build. When we run the power curve analysis, the top 5 Tyrfing builds are shown to easily be the most damaging combinations and the most cost efficient. You can pair Tyrfing with whichever of these items you prefer, and you'll have a solid power curve. I also want to show you the best pairings of items when you've built Dagger of Frenzy. So here are the best 2 item combinations when Dagger of Frenzy is active. Tyrfing is the highest damage pairing, scaling well with the increased attack speed provided when Dagger of Frenzy is active. We also have Deathbringer and Demon Blade pairing, which like I said earlier will scale well with the increased basic attack damage. If we run the power curve analysis, we can see Sunbeam Bow is the most cost efficient pairing, and its yellow damage scales off of the extra basic attack damage and attack speed provided by an active Dagger of Frenzy. I don't think Lifesteal will be great in Open Beta 8, but if you did want to build it, here are the top 10 highest damage combinations with Lifesteal. Again, I've put the 2 combinations here so you can compare the damage of going and not going Lifesteal. Nimble Ring has no strength, but it is now the only lifesteal item that has attack speed on it, meaning it pairs well with Tyrfing. But Nimble Ring is a low lifesteal item, and it's expensive, as it has a strong late game passive. When we run the power curve analysis, this graph is just showing us that all lifesteal items are paired best with Tyrfing in the early to mid game. If we look at the highest damage combinations of 3 items for ADCs, Tyrfing, Bragg's Harp and Odysseus' Bow is at the top, and then the strong combination of Tyrfing with Demon Blade and Deathbringer. Then we can see different combinations of similar items as we move down the list. If we run the power curve analysis, the top damage 3 item combination is also the most cost efficient, but the crit build is shown to be expensive and so has a weak power curve. This graph poses a slight problem for ADCs now. Last patch, the best 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 item power curves all matched up. By which I mean, if you built for the best 5 item power curve, you'd also be building for the best 1 to 4 item power curves. So you didn't have to worry about sacrificing any of your early game damage in order to have the best late game damage. This is now not the case. The best 1 item power curve was Tyrfing, the best 2 item curve was Tyrfing and Sunbeam Bow, but the best 3 item curve is Tyrfing, Braggies and Odysseus' Bow in that order. So you'd have to skip the best 2 item power curve in order to have the best 3 item curve. There isn't a huge difference in power curves between these item combinations, but we'll see later on just how exaggerated this effect will become later on in the game. The best 3 item combinations stay pretty consistent with the best 1 and 2 item power curves, with Tyrfing, Braggies, Sunbeam Bow, Brace of the Abyss and Odysseus' Bow shown to be in the best 3 item combinations of items you can have. Notice how Rage hasn't even appeared yet. So when I showed you the top late game builds earlier, that contained full crit and penetration. You can imagine how weak those builds are in the early game, but I'll show you exactly how weak they are in comparison in a little while. If you've built Dagger of Frenzy, which I think might be meta this patch, here are the top damage combinations of 3 items when Dagger of Frenzy is active, just so you're aware of what items should be paired with it if you're trying to optimize your power curve. There are lots of options here, so build whatever you prefer. Crit is strong with Dagger of Frenzy, but it's expensive, and so builds like this have a super strong single item curve, but a weak 2 and 3 item curve, because Dagger of Frenzy will be super strong when built as a first item, but then when you buy Demon Blade and Deathbringer, those items are expensive expensive, and so will give you a weak power curve. If you've built Lifesteal, Nimble Ring is the highest damage lifesteal item you can have in any combination of 3 items. But again, it and other lifesteal items early game is super weak, so I'm not recommending you build Lifesteal first. They removed the flat penetration off of Devar's Gauntlet, which reduces its damage compared to the last patch, but it provides much more lifesteal than Nimble Ring and is much cheaper, which is why the Nimble Ring builds fall down hard when we consider their power curves. Again, if you have built Lifesteal, you want to pair it with Tearfing, Sunbeam Bow, Braggy's Harp and Odysseus' Bow to get the best 3 item power curve possible with Lifesteal. When we look at the best 4 item power curves, we're now looking at average time to kill the whole enemy team. So we're looking at the builds that appear lowest on this graph. Not much has changed, with yellow damage still being at the top for the highest damage combination of 4 items for an ADC. Once we run the power curve analysis, the yellow damage builds are shown to have the best power curves over the crit builds again, with the best power curve being Tearfing, Sunbeam Bow, Braggy's and Odysseus'. Now, when we considered 1 and 2 item power spikes, I gave Rage 0 stacks. When we looked at the best 3 item combinations, it had 1 stack. For the best 4 item combinations, it had 2 stacks. And now for the best 5 item combinations, it has 3 stacks. You can kind of see what I've had to do here in order for Rage to make sense in my computer simulation. I've had to say that the ADC has built Rage in their 2nd item slot, and has gained a stack every time they buy a new item. I have done that, and Rage has not appeared in any of the top 10 damage combinations of items we've seen so far. But when we look at the top damage combinations of 5 items, we can see it appears in the top damage combination when it has 3 stacks. Which means if you want the highest damage combination of 5 items, you have to build Rage earlier in the game, and you have to sacrifice your 2, 3 and 4 item power curves. Now there is a caveat to this, and that's that the best way I could think to model it was to allow the ADC to get a stack every time they brought a new item, which isn't how Rage works. It stacks off of god kills and assists, but I had to find a way to allow Rage to have a reasonable number of stacks at different points in the game. Now, this might not be the case. If you're already ahead and get lots of god kills and assists, you will stack your Rage quickly. But if you're behind, you might get no kills and assists and never be able to stack your Rage, which adds to the risk of buying the item. The way I have modelled simulates you getting a modest amount of kills and assists as the game progresses. But the point still stands. No matter when you buy Rage, it is a very weak power curve item, but you have to buy it early in order to ensure you stack it as fast and as early as possible. So when you build Rage and go for the highest possible damage late game builds, you will be sacrificing your early game damage, which could cost you the game. The highest possible 5 item combination now is Tearfing, Rage, Demon Blade, Deathbringer and Executioner, assuming Rage has 3 stacks. So if you did build Rage second and managed to get at least 3 stacks on it, you now have the highest possible damage combination of 5 items, but your 2 to 4 item power curve will have suffered greatly. Now, crit with Rage is now appearing in almost all of these damage combinations, but when we do the power curve analysis on these items, we can see the yellow damage build, which is the 2nd highest damage combination of 5 items an ADC can have, easily comes out as having the best power curve, and is also the best 1 to 4 item power curve you can get, building Tearfing, Sunbeam Bow, Braggy's, Odysseus Bow and Executioner in that order, and that gives an almost optimal power curve. This build has a much better power curve throughout the entire game than any of these crit builds, which are much more expensive, rely on item synergy to do the most damage, and require you to build Rage, which is a super weak power curve item. So you can see you have a clear choice to make now. Do you want late game damage, or do you want to try and get ahead early and win the game? So before we jump back into the top late game builds for ADCs, let's quickly compare some builds. So here are a variety of builds for standard hunters, when Hunter's Cowl is the starter item and both enemy tanks have spectral armor. Let's look at the relative power curves of each of these builds. The blue build is the best late game build possible, and its optimal build order is Demon Blade, Rage, Deathbringer, Executioner, Kins and Titan's Bane. We already know the power curve of this build must be weak because we don't have Tearfing as a first item, and all of the top 1 to 5 item combinations we saw contain Tearfing. There's also no Braggy's or Sunbeam Bow, which are shown to be great early game items. Instead, the blue build calls for Demon Blade first, which was shown to have a fairly weak power curve. Anyway, let's compare this to the red build, which has a much more optimal build path. with Turfing, Sunbeam Bow, Odysseus' Bow, Executioner as the first 4 items. And you can see how much the red build is better than the blue build when we look at the second and third item dots. Let's run through some other builds, including the last 2, which are the best late game combinations of 6 items with Lifesteal. Now we can see just how weak the top damage late game build is when compared to the red and green builds, which have much better build paths and are much stronger at every point in the game up until the builds reach their 6th item. If we look at the yellow and purple builds, although the Reaper is shown to be the strongest lifesteal item when it is fully stacked, in the early and mid game it is just so much weaker when compared to building no lifesteal at all. And this will be true for all lifesteal items. They hurt your damage so much throughout the game, especially if you're building rage and crit chance. Having rage in the game and making Deathbringer's passive much stronger makes for some interesting choices now when building, as you have to consider sacrificing your early game power curve for the best late game power spike. When considering rage and crit builds in general, I'd say try and build rage second item, which is what I have assumed in my simulation. But be aware of the state of the game you are currently in. Are you behind the enemy ADC in farm? Is your team losing? Are you getting thrashed in lane? If any of these things are true, maybe consider not building rage, and instead trying to optimize your power curve by buying yellow damage items and cheap penetration items like the Executioner. Rage is super strong, but you have to be confident you can get it stacked in a reasonable amount of time, or your damage will be lacking for most of the game, until you get it stacked or buy more synergizing crit items. And be aware your damage will be low compared to if you'd just gone for a yellow damage build. A more optimal build path might be something like Dagger of Frenzy, Tearfing or Brace of the Abyss, into Rage, Demon Blade, then Deathbringer, Executioner and Kins or Titans. That will give you a good average for your early and late game damage, but we'll look more at optimal build paths when considering late game damage a little later on. So there's lots to consider now when building ADCs, and we're only just getting started. Let's stick to standard hunters for now, and let's consider the optimal builds against every different enemy type. Here are the top 5 highest damage builds for a standard hunter against squishy targets, the enemy solo laner, and the enemy support, and here are the best overall builds that kill the whole enemy team in the fastest time. We can see that if you want to kill a tank fast, you will still want to build Kins in every build, and yellow damage is the most optimal when you assume that enemy tanks have Spectral and Hunter's Cowl is your starter item, but crit builds are still super strong against tanks with Spectral as shown by this build. If I were playing a game and I was ahead of the enemy ADC, this green build is the one I would go for, leveraging Tearfing as a first item, and then transitioning into crit for the late game. If I were behind, I would skip Rage and go for builds more like these, where you skip Rage and go for a more well-rounded build with a better early game damage, but you can still utilize Demon Blade and Deathbringer later on in the build. Now let's consider some specific ADCs. For the numbers for this, I have modelled God's auto attack enhancing abilities, so let's take a look. Firstly, let's start with Anhur's Aspect, that allows him to gain attack speed when hitting a single target. In my model, Anhur has an extra 70% attack speed from his passive, so let's see what his top damage builds look like. Here are Anhur's top damage builds against enemies with Spectral with both starter items. Crit is still the best for late game damage, with the top builds all containing Rage, Demon Blade and Deathbringer. The red build for both starter items shows us that Kins is not necessary on this god, and can be replaced by Tearfing, which will provide great early game damage, especially with Anhur's Aspect. Then you transition into crit for the rest of the build. If you find yourself behind early, here are Anhur's top damage builds with Sharpshooter's Arrow that don't contain Rage. The last 3 builds here will feel particularly effective on Anhur in the early game due to Tearfing and Sunbeam Bow scaling great with his increased attack, and these builds will deliver great DPS in the late game. For Hunter's Cowl builds without Rage, we can see Anhur's builds contain no crit, and you're better off stacking yellow damage, which will also give him the best power curve of any of the builds I've displayed. Here are a variety of different top late game builds in a variety of different situations for Anhur. The blue build is his highest possible late game build. The red and green builds are builds that kill tanks the fastest, and the yellow and purple builds are his top damage builds that contain Lifesteal. The Reaper is fully stacked here and so is showing as his best Lifesteal item, but you can always swap it out for Bloodforge and Devour's Gauntlets for similar results. You can use this graph to decide what kind of build you want to go for. For Artemis, I've allowed her to have her attack speed stim active 50% of the time, because she can extend the length of time her stim is active by landing consecutive auto attacks. She also gains 15% increased auto attack damage when enemies are crowd controlled, so I took her cooldowns into account to determine how often she hits crowd controlled enemies. Her top build is the same as a standard hunter, but Bracer of the Abyss is shown to be a solid item on her in the late game, as the extra auto attack damage from it pairs greatly with crit and her increased basic attack damage, which all compound with each other, making them super efficient when paired together. Again, we can see from these two builds that Kins isn't essential on her to kill tanks quickly, and that Braggy's Harp is a better item on her than Sunbeam Bow, probably because Braggy's has slightly more strength, which scales better with her increased auto attack damage. Bracer of the Abyss is a good late game item on Artemis, because of how her increased auto attack damage scales with crit chance and Bracer of the Abyss's passive, but Tearfing or Dagger of Frenzy will be better on her in the early game, because Artemis has no intelligence scaling, and you won't get the compounding effect of crit when you go Bracer first item. So my recommendation would be to swap Bracer for Dagger of Frenzy or Tearfing, or you might get away with Braggy's Harp too if you're focusing on late game damage, but all 4 of these optimal first items will be solid picks. If we look at her top builds without Rage, we can see the builds, unlike Anhur's Aspect, still attempt to maximise crit chance. That extra 15% auto attack damage on her passive really means you should be trying to maximise crit chance on her, so I would build Rage on Artemis even if I was losing lane. Now let's move on to Bari, who was an interesting god to model. Bari gains Spirit when she auto-attacks enemies. When she reaches max Spirit, she gains a strength, intelligence, and attack speed buff for 5 seconds. This means that when she has higher attack speed, she will be in spirit form more often in the game, because her spirit form scales off of the amount of auto attack she hits. This means that Bari favours attack speed more, so she can get into her buffed state more frequently. The maths behind this is interesting, but I won't bore you with that here. For Bari, Odysseus' bow is in her top build for both Sharpshooter's Arrow and Hunter's Cowl. The extra attack speed from Hunter's Cowl synergizes with her passive and makes it an optimal item for her, even in this crit meta. For each starter item, I would build these 2 builds most of the time, with Tearfing as her first item, but these builds are missing Kins, which will hurt your damage slightly against tankier targets. For the best builds without Rage, if you build Hunter's Cowl, you want a full yellow damage build with high attack speed to increase the rate you build your passive. Sorry, but I left Sunbeam Bow in her builds when I generated these images, and Sunbeam Bow doesn't work on Bari, so the yellow build will do the most damage. But swapping out Sunbeam Bow in any of these builds for Bracer of the Abyss will be a great first item on Bari, because her abilities scale with intelligence and strength. For Sharpshooter's Arrow, you still want to be building crit chance with her. The blue build seems solid and will allow you to leverage Tearfing as a first item, and Odysseus' Bow will allow you to proc your passive faster and scales well with Tearfing. Here are a variety of her top late game builds and build paths. Ignore the red build as Sunbeam Bow has appeared again, but you could happily swap out Sunbeam Bow for Bracer of the Abyss and do really good auto attack and ability damage. The yellow and purple builds are her best late game builds with Lifesteal. Again, swap out the Reaper for Devar's Gauntlet or Bloodforge or even Nimble Ring. If we look at Bari's 7th top build with Lifesteal, it contains Brace of the Abyss and Nimble Ring, which will scale well with her abilities. If you're going for this build, I'd recommend swapping Bracer and Nimble Ring, just to make sure you can contend in the early game. Here are Cernunnos' top builds with both starter items. He has been modelled to have the flat penetration from his first ability, which scales with intelligence, always active, and the damage from his summer stance always active. For Hunter's Cowl builds, Sunbeam Bow appears in his top damage build over Tearfing, but Tearfing comes in super close as shown in the red build. We can see yellow damage items do appear in all of his top builds, which shows us the efficiency he gets from these items, and that they scale well with his autumn and summer stances. His Sharpshooter Arrow builds are similar, but now Bracer of the Abyss appears as his best first item. It scales well with the added crit chance from Sharpshooter's Arrow, and scales well with the flat penetration provided by his autumn stance, which scales off of the intelligence from Bracer. It's up to you to choose which first item you prefer on him. Bracer of the Abyss does have the added benefit of scaling with his abilities, and his spring stance also provides him with extra sustain that scales off of his intelligence. Bracer is also great on a god like Cernunnos, who has great all-in potential in the early game, so Bracer might be his meta first item. For his best builds without Rage, the Hunter's Cowl builds favour pure yellow damage. I like the look of the green build here. It is ordered optimally for damage, but if you swapped Sunbeam Bow and Bracer around, your spring stance would provide you with good sustain in the early game, for a small sacrifice to your damage. Here are a variety of Cernunnos' top builds in different situations. The blue build is his best late game build. The red and green builds are both solid builds against tanks. You can see if you build optimally to kill a tank, you lose about 17% of your damage against squishy targets. His best builds with Lifesteal are the yellow and purple builds, but you can see just how weak they are in the early game. And in fact, his 9th best build with Lifesteal contains Nimble Ring and Bracer of the Abyss, along with other hybrid items, making this a solid and viable hybrid build for Cernunnos, which will have great sustain in the early game, especially if you swap around Brace of the Abyss and Sunbeam Bow again. Next up is Izanami, who gains bonus damage on her auto attacks that scale with intelligence, along with an attack speed stim and penetration bonus. Her top builds with Hunter's Cowl and Sharpshooter's Arrow are pretty similar to a standard hunter, except Brace of the Abyss builds are solid first items with Sharpshooter's Arrow. For her top builds without rage, pure yellow damage builds are best again with Hunter's Cowl, and for Sharpshooter's Arrow, you want a mix of yellow damage with Demon Blade, as shown by her top blue build. The attack speed efficiency of Demon Blade, even when just in a build with Sharpshooter's Arrow, is enough to make Demon Blade a solid pick, even with no other crit items in the build. Again, here are a variety of Izanami's top builds that are good in different situations. You can choose which one suits you best. We can see her best lifesteal item is Nimble Ring, as shown by the yellow build, which is her top damage build that contains lifesteal. Next up we have Jing Wei, who has an attack speed buff in her kit, and has a stim that increases her crit chance and auto attack damage, meaning she scales great with Deathbringer and Demon Blade, because her built-in crit chance will take great advantage of the passives from these items. Her top builds with Hunter's Cowl are similar to other hunters, but her top builds avoid items like Bragg's Harp and Sunbeam Bow, whose passives and stats don't scale well with Jing Wei's increased auto attack damage and crit chance. She instead wants to try and leverage items with higher strength and basic attack damage, like Bracer of the Abyss and Tearfing. The red build shows us that Kins isn't essential on her, and the increased attack speed from Odysseus' bow is enough to push her total damage up. Her top builds with Sharpshooter's Arrow are similar, but Bracer of the Abyss is appearing more because it scales better with the increased crit chance from Sharpshooter's Arrow. Bracer of the Abyss will be an okay first item on Jing Wei, but her abilities have no intelligence scaling, so it is suboptimal. Tearfing and Dagger of Frenzy will be much more suitable on her as a first item. Dagger of Frenzy will scale great with her enhanced auto attack damage in the early game, and Tearfing will scale great with her attack speed stim, especially if you're maxing your first ability first on Jing Wei, which you should be doing as it is your best minion clearing ability, so it's up to you to choose how you want to build her. If we look at her top damage builds against supports, her top damage build against supports is actually the same as her top damage build against a whole enemy team. For most other gods we've seen so far, the top damage builds against supports contained purely yellow damage, so this top build is super effective against all enemy types for Jing Wei, and so it's really desirable in the late game. Maybe going Demon Blade first on Jing Wei could be okay, especially when you consider that she can increase the probability of getting a Demon Blade proc in the early game by using her second ability to increase her crit chance. So Demon Blade first item won't feel as bad on her as other gods, but it's up to you to decide if you want to take that risk. Here are her top damage builds without rage. You can still build Demon Blade and Deathbringer on her even with Hunter's Cowl, and with Sharpshooter's Arrow, you always want Demon Blade and Deathbringer in her builds. Here are Jing Wei's top damage builds and their power curves with Hunter's Cowl in a variety of situations. We can finally see a Devar's Gauntlet build appear in her third top build that contains Lifesteal. And you can see how the power curve of Devar's Gauntlet is better than the Reaper, assuming you only gain one Reaper stack every 4 levels or so. Devar's Gauntlet and the Reaper both have their merits. Devar's Gauntlet is more consistent because it's easier to stack. The Reaper is much more risky, but does provide better damage and much more lifesteal once stacked. Neith is a god who can be built with full intelligence and played as a mid laner, focusing your build on your ability damage. But here, I'm just considering her for her top builds, focusing on her auto attack damage with her Aspect. With her Aspect, Neith gains an attack speed buff based on her strength. So will this be enough for the top builds to value high strength items in order to make the most of her attack speed scaling with her strength? Her top builds stay pretty much identical to those of a standard hunter, and stay the same regardless of if you've built Sharpshooter's Arrow or Hunter's Cowl. I'd recommend building Tearfing on her first, as it provides 50 strength and will scale well with her abilities in the early game. Now let's move on to Rama, who has an attack speed stim in his kit, and can activate his first ability which gives him bonus damage on his auto attacks. This bonus damage now has 10% strength scaling, so will this be enough to alter his top builds when compared to a standard hunter? For Rama without his Aspect, his top top damage builds look very similar to that of a standard hunter again, and can happily stack yellow damage items in his builds, like Tearfing, Kin's Sunbeam Bow and Odysseus' Bow, which scale well with his auto attack stim. And you can build Kin's or not, depending on how much you value killing tankier targets. Tearfing is definitely his strongest first item, especially if you max his attack speed stim earlier on in the game. Here are Rama's top damage builds that don't contain rage, which you might opt for if you fall behind in the early game. For Hunter's Cowl, you want to take advantage of his attack speed stim and build for yellow damage. These builds also have insanely good power curves and make you stronger than the enemy ADC who has built rage as a second item, at least until they stack their rage. For Sharpshooter's Arrow, you still want to be looking to build crit chance, but you don't have to build a lot as shown by the yellow build, which just takes advantage of the crazy amounts of attack speed given by Demon Blade. You definitely want to be building Tearfing first on Rama. His early game scales insanely well with that item. Again, here are a variety of Rama's top builds. The best average damage, the best against tanks, and the best with lifesteal. You can decide what playstyle and power curve suits you the best. Now we can consider Rama's Aspect, which is much more interesting. His Aspect reduces his base attack speed to 0.7, when for most gods it hovers around 1. The interesting thing about this is that attack speed items increase a god's attack speed based on their base attack speed. This means that when a normal hunter goes from 0 to 100% attack speed from items, the amount of attacks they throw out increases from 1 to 2 per second, which is an increase of 1. But for Rama's Aspect, at 0 attack speed, he throws out 0.7 attacks per second. At 100% attack speed, he'll throw out just 1.4 attacks per second, an increase of just 0.7 attacks per second. So essentially, he gets less value out of buying attack speed items than all of the other hunters in the game. Rama's Aspect does increase the strength scaling on the bonus damage from his first ability to 25%. So let's see if any of those facts will shake up his top builds. Here are his top builds with both Hunter's Cowl and Sharpshooter's Arrow. There is almost no difference in the way you should build Rama versus how you should build his Aspect. Even with the decreased efficiency of building attack speed on him, you should still build attack speed items on him, and even yellow damage items that scale really well with attack speed are still core items on him. The fact of the matter is that even with his decreased attack speed scaling, there are pretty much no other options that would allow Rama with his Aspect to maximize damage. If we compare Rama's time to kill the whole enemy team versus Rama's Aspect's time to kill, you could see about a 25% longer time to kill for Rama's Aspect, which is really significant and shows the detrimental effect of the Aspect compared to not having the Aspect. But the Aspect does have the advantage of allowing Rama's wand to always be active, being great for clearing waves in the early game, slowing enemies on every auto attack, and being able to fire through walls is a massive advantage for Rama. So it all comes down to feels. Do you prefer Rama with or without the Aspect? Here are Rama's Aspect's top builds without rage. For Hunter's Cowl, you still want to be stacking yellow damage items, even with his decreased attack speed, and these builds give the best power curves. For Sharpshooter's Arrow, you almost always want to force a Demon Blade into the builds. Now let's consider Sol, who gains increased strength, intelligence, attack speed, and basic attack damage from her passive. So let's see how her top builds shake up. Again, the top possible damage build for both starter items stays the same as a standard hunter, but because Sol gains so many different stats from her passive, it makes a myriad of first items viable on her. Tearfing and Sunbeam Bow both scale great with her attack speed stim, and Brace of the Abyss scales really well with her increased auto attack damage, and especially in the red Sharpshooter's Arrow build where her passive increased auto attack damage, Bracer of the Abyss and Crit Chance scale insanely well together. Kin's does appear in her top builds for both starter items, but doesn't appear in the remaining 4, showing just how much her increased strength and basic attack damage increases her crit damage enough to do substantial damage to tankier targets. All 4 of the best first items are super viable on her. Tearfing will be great for her increased attack speed. Bracer of the Abyss will scale great with her abilities and allow her to be super aggressive in the early game, something that she already excels at. And Dagger of Frenzy will scale nicely with her increased strength and auto attack damage from her passive. Sol is a very versatile god that can be built pretty much however you want. Sol already has a great early game, so I'd likely be buying Bracer of the Abyss, Tearfing or Dagger of Frenzy as first items and trying to push a lead, and then building into Rage and trying to get it stacked early. But I think there is an argument that you could build something like the Reaper on her because she gets so many early stats from her passive, meaning she is always a threat. If you want to build the Aspect with Sol, you want to build a standard mid lane build with high intelligence and focusing on her ability damage. Zeus is the final god I'll be considering in this video. He gains increased base attack damage when he stacks up his passive on enemies, meaning he has insane efficiency with crit chance, and especially Deathbringer. So let's see how his top builds shake up. His top builds for both starter items both call for super high crit chance, but more importantly is that Bracer of the Abyss is shown to be great on him in the late game, pairing well with his increased base attack damage and high crit builds. This is great for Zeus players, as you can comfortably build Bracer of the Abyss first item, which will scale great with his passive and abilities in the early game, making it his best first item. If we look at his top builds with Outrage, we can see Mashami's dual swords now appearing, which shows us just how much his top builds value crit chance. So even if you're behind on Zeus, you should always be buying Rage on him. He scales too well with a pure crit build for him not to buy Rage. Even if it isn't fully stacked, it will be providing great damage on this specific god. I'm still in the process of writing the code for Medusa, Poseidon and Agni, and Cupid and Danza should be built as standard hunters. But remember that both of these gods have some intelligence scaling, so Bracer of the Abyss might be their best first item. Dagger of Frenzy hasn't appeared in any of the top builds because I didn't model it as being active. But remember, it's one of the best first items for ADCs, so if you want to replace Tearfing, Bracer or Sunbeam Bow in any of the builds I've shown you with Dagger of Frenzy, your late game build and power curve will still be great. Thanks for watching, and remember, don't guess, do the math.